Disco Elysium starts the way all great stories do, with the protagonist's birth.
Well, sort of, in a very roundabout sense. Following the brief character creation process, and a garbage quote that definitely isn't going to be important later in the game, we open on a pitch black screen. It's a void, the closest means of visually conveying the vacant emptiness that is prenatal existence. And then, from the darkness emerges a voice.
There is nothing, only warm primordial blackness.
The player's first exposure to the game's rich dialogue system comes in the form of a conversation with the ancient reptilian brain, a representation of the deepest, most primal and instinctual corners of the human mind. Soon after, bodily sensations kick in.
An awareness creeps up on you. A mass lies hidden in your dead angle, soaking in some lurid acidic source.
Then, aspects of deeper thought appear, elements of core character.
Fear and apprehension. You should ask what's out there first.
All of this builds, finally and inevitably, towards the as of now unnamed protagonist is awoken. He's naked, freshly amnesiac, and rocked by the strongest of headaches, like a hairy, hungover newborn. His amnesia-addled state places him in a unique situation. Just like a newborn, he carries with him infinite potential for growth and change. The game's tagline asks of the player, "What kind of cop are you?" It's a question designed to call upon the game's ostensible central premise as a murder mystery, but also one that ultimately stresses that the detective, by all accounts a royal screw-up in his past life, is granted through his rebirth here in Martinez, the middle of nowhere, an opportunity, a chance to forge a new path and create a new identity for himself, whether that be for the better or the worse. This notion of identity is key to the game and something that many have spoken on before us and many will speak on after us. Hell, it's something that we're probably going to talk about too, just because it's so pivotal to the game. But we also want to stress the idea of rebirth and recreation here. Just as the player, through their introduction onto the world, is offered the opportunity to remake the detective's path, Disco Elysium is a game that's characterized by its taking of the conventions of its genre and developing them into something new.
At every turn where it should have been easy to lean upon the conventions of RPG, from the introduction of its own mechanics to the character progression system, Disco Elysium chooses to do something new, to sidestep convention. Disco Elysium took some of the most tedious, ordinary aspects of role-playing games and made them quite possibly the best part of the game, hitting RPG convention squarely in the nuts. A common saying in the gaming sphere is that there are two types of people that play RPG games, those who play it for the plot, and those who play it for the gameplay.
Disco Elysium is one of those rare games that takes both of these aspects and puts them hand in hand, making it possible, even easy, to enjoy both at once. Here's how. The bread and butter of Disco Elysium's gameplay is its dialogue system, the basics of which are handily taught to the player through the game's opening scene. But Disco Elysium is a game with a few other tricks up its sleeve, and it's worth looking into how the game introduces these gameplay mechanics to the player and how that matches up to other RPG games. Let's return to our opening scene, pretending for a moment that we haven't played this game before and therefore are a stranger to how it works. The game trusts us to know that in true RPG fashion, clicking on positions on the floor move us around, and clicking on objects allow us to interact with them. There's a brief on-screen prompt for the player to use the highlight mechanic, which shows the player objects that can be interacted with. But after that, the game essentially works to introduce each aspect of the game as organically as possible. Take for example the game's use of skill checks. In this opening level, there's this tie stuck to a spinning ceiling fan.
This fan has two chain pull switches. One ends in a tiny fan, the other in a light bulb. A truly horrific necktie has somehow attached itself to one of the blades.
The player can opt to try and grab it using this white dialogue option, which has a little descriptor attached saying that it's a check that can be retried. The check has a pretty high skill gate, and so it's pretty likely that the player is going to rather dishearteningly fail the check. However, there's still the option presented to turn off the fan.
You know what you should do. You should stop the fan and then try again. It'll get easier.
Now you can try for the tie again, with your chances of success greatly increased because it turns out that it's easier to grab a tie when it's still. The player, through this simple and short interaction, has managed to learn quite a lot about the intricacies of skill checks. The game provides them with a short descriptor to get the ball rolling, sure, but otherwise it trusts the player enough to connect the dots themselves like a true detective. The rest of the game's mechanics are introduced in a similarly organic manner. When you leave the room, you speak to this woman and get a red check, which builds upon the player's pre-existing knowledge of how skill checks can work. The feature of the Thought Cabinet, which allows the player to internalize an ideal or character trait through a certain amount of in-game hours, which grant them additional gameplay perks or negative effects when complete, is introduced through a number of low-level thoughts attainable early in the game, allowing the player to piece together themselves how the system works and how it can be used to enrich gameplay. Disco Elysium's willingness to trust the player to figure out its mechanics places it directly in contrast with several other games in the RPG genre, which will halt the story or even pause in-game action in an effort to tutorialize their latest scheme. Speaking of good mechanics,
Disco Elysium is an RPG. Like many other RPGs before it, it has a skill system. However, these skills aren't very similar to a classic RPG, where getting a skill is just a blanket way of the game telling you, oh, you can now pass this check. Skills in Disco Elysium allow you to build your character's personality, define what sort of person you are going to be. It's very different from, a game like Skyrim, where your character has the emotional depth of a cardboard box. A cardboard box that you fill up with as many skills as possible, as many abilities as possible, and just expect to go out and do everything. Sure, it can be fun to play, but as a person, I don't even know what the name of the main character in Skyrim was. Pretty sure he didn't have one, but the point is that Disco Elysium has a character who is human, and Disco Elysium has you make a character who is human. To be human is to have flaws, and well, your character does have a lot of flaws, like an absurdly large amount of flaws. It's quite comical how messed up of a person he is. Your character is like a cross between a Unimob student and a homeless person, somewhere in between. Closer to a homeless person, but Unimob student is quite close. Anyways, Disco Elysium's skill system is character focused and determines your personhood. For example, it can have a skill called Authority, in which you can invest points and get the ability to intimidate others, to have more authority pretty much. You can invest in Drama, which allows you to lie and detect when people are lying. Investing in these skills elevates their voices, and don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. You literally hear them more, because conversations in Disco Elysium are between you, the person you're talking to, and the dozens of voices in your head. So giving a personality skill points is just elevating the voice and shaping what sort of a person you are to different people. There's a lot of information about the world in Disco Elysium. Hell, the encyclopedia skill is just exposition about the world. The skill that is quite possibly the most interesting while having the least amount of dialogue is called Shivers. On the surface, Shivers just provides you with information about the world, but the difference between Shivers and maybe a skill like Encyclopedia is the difference between asking a person who lived through a war what the war was like and reading records about the war. There's a very clear difference between the two. If you ask someone what it was like, you get first-hand knowledge of what the emotions the man felt were like, how everyone around him perceived the war. Shivers is very similar to that. You experience a period of time through someone else's perception, through ghosts and architects long before your time, and it's a beautiful experience and very different from pretty much anything other RPGs offer. It feels surreal and beautiful. It shapes how you perceive the world, how you perceive a small building, a conversation. You feel connected with the world of Revachol, and I find it to be beautiful.
If the player manages to play their cards right, then chances are that they're still in a tough spot by what appears to be the midpoint of the game. They've figured out by now that the hanged man, Lily, was in fact shot in the head mid-coitus with the lady named Klasia, and only hanged after the fact as a cover-up. Klasia has done some shady things in the past, and she's fled to Martinez, effectively trying to escape the consequences of her actions. With her help, the detective and Kim have chased loose threads, come across dead ends, and inevitably committed some dubious acts, painstakingly inching their way towards solving the mystery of the hanged man's murder. Then, at the end of the game's third day, the detective and Kim return to the Whirling in Rags to see this.
Welcome to the fucking reckoning. Put your damn gun down. People are gonna get hurt.
Lely's murder has heightened existing tensions between the company of mercenaries that he was a part of and the union workers that were claiming to have hanged him. Whatever the player's done up until now has not been enough to quell these tensions. It's escalated to the point that it's clear there's going to be violence. What essentially follows are a series of checks and dialogues as the detective desperately attempts to bring the situation to a halt. His level of success varies depending on how the player rolls and how prepared they are. But no matter what happens, the game dictates that the detective is shot and that people die in the conflict. The standoff and its consequences are not something that can be sidestepped by adequately buffing out the main character. It's not the outcome of picking all the bastard dialogue options or of losing enough karma across your playthrough. It's a feature of the game, the inevitable climax of a narrative that's predicated upon the failures of a police detective to do his job and the fallout that comes from that decision. Disco Elysium is a game in which the choices the player makes are undeniably important, but I'd hesitate to call it a choices matter game because it approaches the notion of choice in a very different way to those operating within RPG convention. A game like Mass Effect is similarly hailed as a game in which your choices matter, with the game presenting its player with a number of choices at certain points in the game, their decision ultimately affecting the unfolding of the plot at later dates. The player makes a choice, and the narrative twists and snaps and crunches accordingly. The branching narrative system is one that's well-worn, familiar, and helps the players to feel important, if not one that's a bit rigid in its approach to choice and, unless implemented on a massive scale, rather ordinary in its scope. On the other end of the spectrum are games in the vein of Fallout 3, which place an emphasis on the freedom of choice. You can go anywhere and do anything, and the game isn't going to punish you. Such an approach seems like a good idea until you remember it was the one that was implemented by Fallout 3. Aspects of these games remain in Disco Elysium. Side quests embrace the silly fun of making a stupid decision and seeing its consequences played out, and the game's sprawling map clearly owes something to the open world games that came before it. But largely, Disco Elysium's plot is one that refuses to make way for the player. The player is always too late to stop the shootout, they're always shot, and they always head to the island at this bit of the game. You're just a detective, the narrative seems to be asserting. The world is going to go on spinning without you. Instead, the types of choices that Disco Elysium emphasizes the importance of are those concerning the interior. You may just be a cop, but you get to decide the type of cop you're going to be. The detective may not be important in the grand scheme of things, but what gives them meaning is their personal search for identity and the impacts it has upon those they interact with. I mentioned before that the detective uses a series of skill checks in order to try and handle the shootout occurring outside the Whirling in Rags. Depending on how the player plays, the skills that they've given increases and the equipment that they have picked up along the way, the confrontation can end in one of a number of ways. It's here that the choices that Disco Elysium offers its players become clear. The plot is largely going to be linear, however, Disco Elysium allows for the development of nuance, both in terms of the player's internal characterization and the way that they interact with the world around them. We've covered a lot of the game's plot and analysing its mechanics, so let's take a look at how it all ends. After waking up, the detective returns to the scene of the crime, where a final clue left behind by Klasia leads them to determine that the shot that killed Lely came from an old sea fort off the shore of Martinez. Klasia has had crucial evidence in tow this entire time, evidence that she could have shared at any point, preventing a myriad of tragedies, but she's kept it secret because to do so would not only be endangering herself, but would also mean that she has to confront the past in a way that she came to Martinez expressly to avoid having to do. Together, you and your partner head to the sea fort and take a look around. It's abandoned. But after a while, you can leave the fort, and it's here that you meet the culprit of the crime, a figure known in-game as the Deserter.
An old man wearing tracksuit trousers, leans on the frame stock of his rifle. He gathers a big ball of spit in his mouth, then spits it out into the extinguished fire before him. He raises his black eyes, hooded by creased eyelids, to meet you.
He's a bitter old ex-soldier from a failed communist revolution. A deserter who's mad at the world and everyone in it for his ideological failure. He's isolated himself from the world because he refuses to engage in a society that's so different from how he sees it should have been. He's been stalking and spying on the residents of Martinez through the scope of a sniper rifle loaded with a single bullet, a remnant from his war days. And one day, while watching the two get it on, whether it be out of sexual envy for Klasia, to whom he had formed a sort of parasocial obsession with since observing her, or an ideological rage at Lely and what he stood for, he decided to shoot him in the head. The deserter is a man haunted by the past, the manifestation of decades of guilt and anger left over from the failure of the revolution. He's a man that the detective, similarly haunted by ghosts of his own past, threatens to become if he refuses to let go, if he continues to substitute substance abuse and alcohol for self-reflection. It's a brutal, depressing, and honest image of a man who is nobody. All that defines him is external now, his hatred for capitalism, for the union, the world. The deserter exists merely as a caricature of living, eaten up by envy and hatred for those living a life that he can never attain. And then the game's over. You and your partner head back to Martinez, where you find your old team waiting for you. There you have a brief chat about the murder and your new identity before going home. There's a brief reveal that your emotional breakdown began with the falling apart of your soon-to-be marriage, but other than that, the game provides little to no closure of anything that occurred over the course of the last few days. Credits roll, thanks for playing. It's a very strange and abrupt sort of ending. I've heard it dismissed as pretentious or inherently unsatisfying because of its presentation of the answer to the mystery that it's propped upon being one that's impossible to piece together using the clues given to the player over the course of the game. However, the game does give you clues.
Love did me in, brother Copo. It was love all along.
And the game understands how frustrating it is to have the mystery solved in a way that you never could have done if you were an actual detective.
So it is.
For a second he seems tired.
I think that to complain about the game's ending is akin to complaining that there's no way to dodge the bullet outside the whirling in rags. It's failing to understand how Disco Elysium is subverting expectations and in doing so creating a much stronger gameplay experience. The introduction of the deserter and the confrontation between you and your posse are crucial to the function of the game, and in order to understand why, it's pertinent that we look at Oh.
The Furies are at home. In the mirror, it is their address. Even the clearest water, if deep enough, can drown. Iris Thomas.
Disco Elysium opens on a quote from R.S. Thomas's Reflections, which is a poem that explores the difficulties of avoiding one's self-image or the shifting elements of one's identity that may be seen in any mirror. Thomas's assertion is that you can't run away from the Furies, the disparate warring fragments of your mind. There's no way to subvert or overcome them. You'll never have complete control over who you are. You can only take in the frigid facts of identity as they come and attempt to live with them, but only in death can you find genuine peace with yourself. It's an idea that's especially relevant for Disco Elysium, which at its core is a game about how the past always encroaches upon our present and is inescapably carried with us. You can't just click your fingers and go on. You can't fully forget or escape it either. For all the reinvention and playing around with identity that the detective partakes in, none of it allows him to escape from the terrible consequences of his past. The best that any of us can do is face the past, reconcile with it, and learn to swim with it. Something that figures like Klasia and the deserter ultimately aren't able to do. Klasia can't help but run, to flee at every turn, no matter the consequences. Her final act in the game is to disappear from Martinez, ever running from a past that's only going to keep catching up with her. On the other end of the spectrum, the deserter lives entirely in the past. He's let himself be subsumed and defined by his rage at circumstances in his history. I said that the game effectively ends after you confront the killer, but I lied. Sorry, it can end there, it certainly did on my first playthrough. But if the player completes a certain checklist of items in the game, when their conversation with the deserter is over, they're able to talk to a cryptid.
The creature stands on long stilt-like legs, antennae hanging from his head like a woman's hair. white and curled at the tips. It is no more than 5 steps away from you.
The phasmid is a completely alien creature, and yet one that's been living on Earth for far longer than humans have. Through its conversation with Harry, the player is able to glean the importance of things like failure, the complexity of human emotion and its consequences. The conversation with the phasmid is one that stresses that your humanity and the mistakes that it allows for are terrifying, but ultimately they're beautiful and new and unlike anything else in this world.
Few of us can begin to imagine the horror of you, with all of creation reflected in your forebrain. It must be like the highest of hells, a kaleidoscope of fire and writhing glass, eternal damnation, even when you're sleeping. And when you wake, you carry it around on your neck, with eyes open that cannot help but swallow more behind the mirror. I feel great, mute empathy for you. Arthropods are in silent and meaningless awe of you. Know that we're watching. When you're tired, when the vision spins out of control, the insects will be looking on, rooting for you.
It's not something that you should run away from or disavow in a hate-filled rage. It's not something you can. It's a conversation that binds every single one of Disco Elysium's gameplay notions together, and it's an indication that the game knows what it's doing with its subversion from the RPG convention. It's not different for difference's sake, but instead seeks to tell a story about how terrifying the human condition is, and yet how utterly worth it the various complexities that make up our inner brain spaces and fuel our failures are. Disco Elysium is fantastic, not because it's well written or uses mechanics well, because it's so human. And really, that's all we can ever ask of a game. Thanks for watching.